think the conservatism that is necessary and most useful to all of us today is not your father's or grandfather's conservatism. It can't be. And it's not the intellectual conservatism of Roger Scruton or Russell Kirk, men I admire and practically worshipped in my youth. I think what's needed is significantly bolder and more robust, more aggressive, more in your face, I think the Americans like to say. See, I no longer consider myself an American. It's kind of interesting. There was, when I was growing up in the 80s, I went to college from 86 to 1990. I was raised on a steady diet of beer and chocolate, yes, but also William F. Buckley, Russell Kirk, Reagan, and it was the era of the Reagan era, yes. It was the era of kind of fusionism. The fusionism began in the 40s and 50s and 60s. That fusionism that they talked about, that led to Reagan in the White House, and that was promoted by National Review and Bill Buckley, was a unwieldy alliance of libertarians, social conservatives, and anti-communists. Many of you probably have heard that before. That fusionism is no longer useful to any of us. That fusionism is inert. It has no power. It has nothing to say to the challenges of us that we face today. I like to talk about a new fusionism. And it's really a combination of a very strong nationalism, a defense of national sovereignty, also a search for and a defense of national identity, including an ethnic kind of identity. Is Kemi Badenoch truly an English conservative? Does she represent what English conservatism is about? I think not. And a lot of young conservatives in Britain don't see her as the future of conservatism in England. There's many ways to tackle that question of identity. And then religion. So nationalism, identity, and religion. This is one of the ways to look at the new fusionism. I prefer a different way, which I'll get into, and it's embodied or symbolized by Orbán, Milei, and Trump. And I'll get to that. I found just the other day a little quotation from Christopher Rufo, an American, and he was having a debate with Curtis Yarvin, who some of you may know, of the neo-reaction. And Rufo said this, I am a conservative, but not in the way you imagine. I use the label as a convenient way to position myself in the political debate, but I am neither conservative by temperament nor by political ambition. I want to destroy the status quo rather than preserve it. I think that's where we should all be. All right, so let me talk a little bit about where we are right now, other than this beautiful fraternity and this beautiful city and what remains of old Europe. I think we're all, in case you haven't realized, we've been enslaved. And it's the serfdom, not that Hayek talked about, it's a different kind of serfdom. I think through various mechanisms and agencies, both at the national level and at the supranational level, we have been reduced to serfs. In addition, through cultural revolutions and societal shifts, some of those facilitated and financed by our own governments, we, inheritors of the West, of the Christian West, have been cornered and muzzled and enslaved. And we're now beholden to bigger and broader international powers. I want to talk briefly also about another layer of control, because I mentioned the national level, let's say mafias, and then the international multilateral ones, the supranational ones, and then there's the other one that's not territorial, that's not bound, and that's the big tech. And increasingly I've been seeing people talk about technofeudalism. I like this term. Because it builds on the work of Joel Kotkin a few years ago, a sociologist, historian. See, they're coming for me already. Can't escape them. Joel Kotkin wrote a book about the new feudalism. I think if you add the tech component there, it makes a lot of sense. The technofeudalism that's also helped to enslave us. And that technofeudalism is not just, I'm not really getting to the issue of surveillance or Chinese spies through TikTok. That's not really my concern. My concern is more of the uber wealthy, Elon Musk. I mean, it's no surprise, it shouldn't be a surprise that you're seeing animosity between Steve Bannon and Elon Musk. And Bannon wants Musk out. He says, go back to South Africa. I mean, I think that's very interesting. But Elon Musk is a representative of the kind of techno power that's enslaving us. I mean, I'm talking about his wealth. I'm talking about the massive concentrations of wealth around the world, which has no allegiance. That big capital has no allegiance to any state, territory, religion, creed, or ethnic group. And as we know, I mean, visit London or Paris or other formerly beautiful cities. Those urban centers of the West are increasingly owned by who? The super wealthy. But from where? From Dubai, from China. Go around the Innenstadt here, the Erzgebirge, and ask, go to some traditional Beisel or restaurant and try to find out if they'll tell you who owns the place. You know, you'll be surprised. There's very few that are still owned by the same family or by an Austrian family. Many have passed into the hands of big capital, but not our kind of big capital. Like I said, the Middle East and China. Unlike the medieval feudalism, this techno-feudalism, as the term itself suggests, is at the hands of the tech giants, as I've already said. And putting aside the fact that X and Facebook, or whatever platform you prefer, can be useful to us at times to get the word out, to promote a candidate, to comment on something that's happened, putting that aside, it's made us all dependent on massive servers and big data. And as we've seen over and over again in the last few years, the moment you go too far with a statement, you can be canceled or removed or disappeared. More importantly, though, and this is something young audiences are not prepared to hear, the dominance of big tech, of this techno-feudalism, has moved us away from the book, the written word. Why does that matter? Well, as people like Neil Postman have warned us, or Giovanni Sartori, an Italian, never been translated into English, they've both talked about the cognitive effects that over-reliance on the flickering screen on the television or the computer monitor can have on us, and how it makes us increasingly unsuited to be citizens of a modern state, and increasingly unable to engage in a democracy or a political system. And we're being reduced to, I don't know, zombies? Monkeys? Choose your metaphor, choose your image. Now, I want to talk now about the main point of this brief talk, which is disruption, the disruptive conservatism that I'm increasingly advocating. I used to be more intellectual, right? Like, we should all be reading books and sitting at home and pondering the great thoughts of old. No, I've changed. I think it's time for greater and more expanded dissent and disruption. I won't use the R word, revolution, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see more and more outbreaks of social unrest in the coming years. I used to predict 20, 30, 40 years. I think it's moving faster. I think it's accelerating. I think it's going to be 5, 10, 15 years. Very briefly, there have been earlier diagnoses of what I'm talking about, what I'm doing in my own clumsy way. You can go back to like James Burnham, some of you may know that name, the managerial revolution, and he begins to explore and analyze this concept of managerialism, where the state and private sector corporations are increasingly managed by a technocratic elite, usually from the same schools, usually from the same backgrounds. In the 60s, C. Wright Mills wrote The Power Elite, taking up from where Burnham kind of left off and expanding the analysis. But I'll mention two others, more recent, and elaborate a little bit on each. There's John Marini, who has done extensive work on the administrative state, which I also use interchangeably with what is called the deep state. John Marini has been writing about the administrative state for decades. He calls it the invented fourth branch of government. He says it has usurped and consolidated the powers of the other three branches into the hands of an unelected bureaucratic elite. He's talking of the American context, obviously, but the same has happened in most other countries over the decades. By the way, I want to just add this in. The administrative state and the supranational entities, the multilateral bureaucracies that I've referred to already, are in many ways the direct outgrowth or the product of the progressive era in the US. And the progressive era is characterized, I'll give you names, Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt, others. It's characterized by this belief that, well, we all went to Harvard and Yale. We know more than the average yokel in small town America, so we should be running government. And by the way, we should set up these new organizations because the rest of the world could benefit from our intelligence as well. So they set up the World Bank and the IMF and the UN, etc. It's all these things, all these mechanisms, these structures are set up by that same elitist mentality. No offense to any elitists in this room. I'm one. I mean, I believe in elites, but just the right kind of elites, right? So just to finish off with Marini, the administrative state for him represents the living, breathing manifestation of technocratic progressive government. I think that point's been made. And as Bannon says, 2 times I've mentioned Bannon, so that means something, right? As Bannon says, we have to deconstruct the administrative state, I think worldwide. The other person who's pushed the analysis of what's going on, of these power structures, is Curtis Yarvin, who I mentioned earlier in his debate with Christopher Rufo. And Curtis Yarvin uses a metaphor, various metaphors, he's an interesting writer. He talks about the cathedral, and it's fascinating, right? Yarvin, let me try to summarize it in the clumsy way here. Yarvin believes that real political power is held by something he calls the cathedral, which is an informal amalgam of universities and the mainstream media and press, the entertainment industries, all dominated by the US, which collude to sway or control public opinion and create, thusly, a new reality for an ignorant public. Yarvin has further argued that the so-called Brahmin social class continues to dominate American society, preaching progressive values. Now, it's interesting. The Brahmin social class is, in my view, the class that originally built America. But then they capitulated completely in the 50s and 60s because they allowed the student revolutionaries to take over the prestigious universities. It's that same Brahmin class that has allowed everything to get worse in America. But anyway, Yarvin's not talking about the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants here when he's talking about Brahmins. He's just using it as a socioeconomic term. He's using it to talk about the super wealthy. He's using it to talk about, in part, the big tech people that I mentioned earlier. This cathedral pushes this progressive ideology onto an unsuspecting general population. But let me just finish this Yarvin bit off by summarizing in the following way. The cathedral is just a short way of saying journalism plus academia plus finance. Now, regardless of which of these analyses, Burnham, Mills, Yarvin, Marini, regardless of which one seems more accurate or is more accurate, doesn't matter. I mean, what the point here is that there is something that has happened worldwide and at the national level, and we need to find ways to resist, push back, disrupt it. Now, a lot of people say, no, well, we need to be gentlemen about this, of course. We need to proceed with caution and prudence, and we want to make sure we have a consensus-based approach to things and not leave people out, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that has worked at all. If you look at the past 50, 60, 70 years, I think it's a time, as I said in the very beginning, a time for a more robust conservatism. Some of you may know this, but the people who work at these multilaterals and the UN and all the many different bodies in Geneva and Zurich. It's amazing. There's an international commission for everything: tobacco, school teachers, the Olympics, and most of them share the following characteristics: no taxes on salary, no worldwide tax, tax-free salaries, and those salaries are generous. No property taxes. The UN sits on, in New York, probably the most expensive piece of land in America. They pay no taxes on it. There's no accountability. Example, there was an outbreak of cholera in Haiti many, many years ago. The cholera was the result of human feces going down the river and then afflicting the local population. That feces came from the encampments of the UN workers that had been brought in to help with the clearing up of some post-hurricane tragedy or disaster. NGOs, who love to look for reasons to file lawsuits, right, realized this was going on and filed a lawsuit against the UN in New York. They took it to the Secretary General and he said, well, thank you. I'm very sorry about that, but so what? I mean, there's no court in the world where you can take that lawsuit. The UN is exempt. A few more characteristics of these multilateral bodies. Their funding is significant. They work directly with ministries of finance and other powerful agencies in recipient countries. Recipient countries that have been receiving largesse from the World Bank, for example, and other groups, and yet are still in poverty after 50, 60, 70 years. How is that? Oh, and by the way, some of the leaders of those countries are now millionaires and have bank accounts in Zurich or Geneva. You know, it's interesting how it all works. Finally, well, I think I've gone on long enough. Let me show some charity toward the multilateral world. And I'll stop there. Unlike Meloni, Orbán has basically gone head-to-head with the EU mandarins. You have to admire that. Milei and Trump, speaking at the World Economic Forum just a day or two ago, they're speaking courageously, I think. And I think they represent governments that could represent or symbolize a kind of new fusionism. They're reasserting national sovereignty. They're proud of their country and whatever identity they think it has. It's very good. I think this is the way forward. They're disrupting things. I'll wind up with just a few quick examples, 2 or 3 of each man and what he's been doing. Trump, first thing he did, first day, many executive orders, amazing. But he recognizes man and woman as the only 2 genders. You could almost hear people freaking out on the sides, like, what? That is disruptive. After so many years of being told that there are multiple genders, 47, 74, after this stuff being forced on our children, here's the president disrupting things. He's pardoned pro-life activists and the January 6th insurrectionists. Ridiculous. They had no weapons. Nonsense. He's pardoned them. Again, the liberal elites in America are aghast. And then I mentioned he spoke at Davos. Trump has shamed Bank of America for canceling or closing accounts of pro-life leaders. Now, Milei, he's doing his own good work. He's cutting bureaucracies. You've all seen that famous video of him where he's going through the chart and saying, fuera, out, gone. It's fantastic. Let's see how far he gets before the establishment there stops him. He's been talking against the elites at Davos on their own territory, in their own hallways. He's been criticizing them. And he's pro-life. I think that's disruptive in our era. And he's pushing it. And Orbán, well, the examples abound. But my favorite is that when he was being pushed and they were trying to bully him a little bit, what does he do? With Kickle, he starts the Patriot. He says, to hell with you guys, I'm going to start my own grouping. And he does. And it's the 3rd strongest right now. So I like to use more and more this example of Orbán, Milei, and Trump. Let's see how far they get. As I've admitted, they're not necessarily conservative in the strict sense, but they're disrupting things. And I think that's what we need to do if we're ever going to rebuild things, if we're ever going to look through the civilizational rubble and try to find those things to put them back together. We can't do that unless those power structures and those elites are displaced, dislodged, removed. And I don't see that happening easily if we continue to do politics as usual. I'll close with the following. I've been talking solely about what statesmen have been doing and can do. We all can do our own things in our own little spheres too. And I have things that we can talk about during the break, perhaps, in media and publishing. That's my area. Other forms of rabble-rousing, like what Alexander Shugol did with the Pachamama. And other forms of resistance. And I think my last comment is I've been reading more and more Ernst Junger, particularly Der Wahlgang. I think that's a very important book. Short, brief, but very important, has a lot to say to us living in this particular moment now and about the need for intellectual guerrillas. So thank you for your time.